we're starting this off with the fun topic of video game privacy. And if there was ever a year to talk about video game privacy, this is the year. So first, you guys don't know me. I am that guy. So a little bit about me. I've worked both in-house at Ubisoft and EA doing privacy and consumer protection work for both of them. Been in the gaming industry for a number of years. I was in the gaming industry before I went to law school. And started actually off on the IP track and then kind of made a pivot to privacy, which is really, really a growing field and really, really hot right now. I will also give the standard disclaimer that these are all my own thoughts and opinions. I'm not speaking on behalf of either of those companies or any company, not formal legal advice. I'm sure you'll hear that multiple times. So also I'll give one other disclaimer, which is that privacy, we're still very much in the Wild West phase of privacy. I mean, we've got the GDPR, which, just a show of hands, who's familiar with it? Okay, so everybody's familiar. Who's done GDPR work? Okay, so cool. So we have a little bit of understanding. Some people are new to it. We're gonna go over that, both high level and we'll dig into the weeds a bit. But disclaimer, it's still very new law. It's less than a year old. It just came into force in May. There haven't been any major enforcement actions. There's been a couple of complaints filed. We'll talk about those a little bit. And there's many more changes to the privacy landscape coming soon, as in developments happening last week. So with all of this advice, your mileage, your risk tolerance may vary a bit based on the size of your company and your resources. So this presentation, we're going to go over three things. We're going to talk about the GDPR generally, because that was just the thing this year. We'll talk about the purpose, the jurisdiction, penalties, basically how the GDPR changed how we think about privacy. And then we'll get into some practical advice. If you are either a lawyer and you're advising clients, or if you're a client who handles data, we'll talk about what some of the high-level and most important takeaways for you are under the GDPR. So data mapping, retention, privacy by design. We'll talk a little bit about how data sharing agreements have changed in the wake of the GDPR, and we'll also talk about data subject access requests. Then, last but not least, we'll talk about what's next for 2019. There's a lot of stuff coming. The e-privacy directive in the EU, some enforcement actions that we're starting to see, and then we will get out of the European mindset. We'll talk about what's happening here in the United States and in the NCSA region. So California's privacy law, Latin America, we'll kind of hit on some federal privacy law. I'm cool with people asking questions and raising their hands and making this an open discussion. So if you have thoughts or questions, just raise your hands or just speak out. Okay, so first, I just table set, but why do we care? So privacy, again, it's this very growing topic, but why do we care? And really, I mean, you can kind of see this, but there's just no shortage of articles and issues about privacy, and people care. People care about their privacy, and just speaking purely from a consumer perspective, it's a big. It makes a big difference to consumers. So this, you can't really read it, but it says I'm more likely to purchase brands from consumer products companies that I believe will protect my personal information. So it's almost 80% of consumers think that this is important to them. And the flip side is that over 70% are not going to buy from a company that they don't believe will protect their personal information. So this makes a big deal. Just putting the legal stuff aside, this is an important issue for consumers. And games are particularly prone to this. Games are specifically impacted by privacy scandals. Here's just a couple of them. Take-Two gets sued on face scanning. Class action lawsuits for their NBA app. These are these Disney apps that are spying on your kids and violating COPPA. All of these just articles about video games and privacy, and it's partially because, unlike most other entertainment industries, the amount of data and the relationship with the consumer is so much closer and more direct than, say, a movie. You go to a movie, the movie doesn't really know anything about it. You play a game, if the game has been collecting data over a period of 60 to 70 hours for a AAA game, they know a lot about you. And what they do with that data is really, really important for the experience. And one last thing is that gamers tend to be particularly savvy, and they are particularly technically savvy and privacy conscious. So that's part of why you see so many more, like, is my Xbox spying on me? Because this is something that gamers care about, especially. So with that, that's why we care about privacy. But aside from the PR stuff and the relationship with consumers, 2018 was the year of a lot of legislation and a lot of regulatory changes and real legal consequences for having data mismanagement, and specifically the EU GDPR. So at a high level, this was a European regulation. It was passed a couple years ago, finally became effective May 25th of this year. The goal was basically just to harmonize data protection across the EU. So lots of different laws, different regimes. The idea was to bring it all together and to increase privacy protections for EU citizens, with the idea of let's enhance individual citizens' rights around their personal data. This was also very much passed in response to a lot of the data gathering and the Googles and Facebooks of the world. They wanted a tool to protect European privacy against American companies. Excuse me. So the idea was to empower European DPAs, so data protection authorities, to protect European citizens and their data. So we'll talk about jurisdiction for a second. So the GDPR applies to EU citizens' data. So that's regardless of who the identity or the jurisdiction of where you're collecting or storing the data. If you are doing business in Europe, or you have a website where Europeans can go, the GDPR does apply to you. So that means basically anybody who's operating an online business. And there are some big fines. So this was designed to be a pretty, they wanted to put some teeth in this regulation. So the maximum penalty is 20 million euros or 4% of global annual turnover, whichever is greater. So if you're talking about a AAA company like EA yourself, you're talking 200 million range. So this is serious. Now, obviously, we haven't seen any enforcement actions. We haven't seen any fines levied, but this is serious, and this is why a lot of companies have really taken the GDPR to heart. It's probably also why you saw a number of emails in your inbox around May of this year about we've updated our privacy policy for the GDPR, and a bunch of companies you've never heard of who are now contacting you trying to get your consent to their privacy policy. I'll pause for a moment. Any questions, comments, thoughts? Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the GDPR, just as a high level of like how it changed the paradigm, like what really is different under the GDPR. So this idea that all data is created equal is not true. The GDPR changes how we think about data and how we think about the risks associated with data. You probably heard the terms of PII and non-PII, personally identifiable information, non-personally identifiable information. The GDPR kind of blows that up a little bit and talks about personal and non-personal data. So it's worth kind of digging in a little bit on what this really means and how to visualize it and kind of conceptualize it. So if you have the universe of consumer data, this is all data that is associated with your players. So this is the kind of Venn diagram of all the data. So you've got aggregated statistics. 2,000 people played our game at 2 p.m. on a Saturday, and you can have anonymous statistics. You can have aggregated statistics that gives you insight. Oh, our game is most popular on Saturdays. So that's kind of anonymized data that's not specific to any individual person. Then you have, within this Venn diagram, you have data that's tied to individual identifiers. So that would be something like a Ubisoft Club ID or a gamer tag or your avatar. So it's pseudonymous in that it's not linked to Sam or Ross, but it's linked to a specific machine or identity or account. So we sometimes refer to this as pseudonymous or indirectly identifying information. I don't know necessarily who, gamertag is a bad gamertag, but gamertag123 is, but somebody does. And if I had the database and the table to identify who gamertag, I worked for Microsoft and I could look it up, it's indirectly identifying. Somebody could figure out who that was. Then within the realm of indirectly identifying, you have directly identifying. So this is data that's linked to the player's real-world identity. So their phone number or their email address. This is something that you could use on its own to contact a person in the real world. So if I had your phone number, I can reach you. I know who you are. So obviously we're getting progressively more and more sensitive, right? So this is what we typically call PII, personally identifiable information, or directly identifiable information. And then within this category, you got super sensitive stuff, like credit card numbers, or passport information, or social security numbers. This is stuff that not only identifies you, but is really dangerous if it were to get out in the open, and you don't want it falling into the wrong hands. So it could cause immediate harm if disclosed. If I put your credit card number and all of your information online, that's a pretty serious breach. Biometric information also falls into this category. So we have this kind of increasing order of sensitivity. And it's all subject to the privacy policy. It's all consumer data. It's all, you have to have a plan for how you're going to deal with it. But it scales. So what we generally thought of before the GDPR is the stuff that you really have to worry about is this, the PII and the extra sensitive PII. If it's not immediately linkable to somebody else, it's okay. We kind of can do whatever we want with it, as long as it's part of the privacy policy. The GDPR really broadens this definition to include pseudonymous data. So even if it's just associated with the gamer tag, it's still considered personal information. That's a pretty big paradigm shift. If anybody on the planet could use this information to identify a person, then it's personal. Now, no need to panic. It doesn't necessarily change how we handle it, but it does change how we talk about it, and it changes our risk tolerance for it. Like, for instance, you still have to secure all of the data in kind of with respect to the risk to consumers if disclosed. So I take it back. We do have to change how we handle it, but it doesn't completely upend things. It does, however, change how we talk about personal data and how we have to think about it and discuss it. So that's kind of a bit of the sea change. Getting into the nitty-gritty of some of the GDPR requirements, you're required in the GDPR to have a data map. I start with this because it is the most boring. And I show all these examples because there is no one way to do a data map. The idea is that all personal data, which, as we just established, includes a lot. If you're a gaming company and you have a lot of information tied to a personal identifier, or just like a player ID, that's all personal. You have to map it. So you can have data flow diagrams. You can kind of map out where the different repositories are. This is kind of, at a high level, this is really about documentation. This is about making sure that you know exactly where the data is going within your company and who controls it, who has access to it, etc. I don't think that anyone is ever going to get in legal trouble because their data map looks like this or that. Like, it's not really about how you do it, it's that you need to be able to understand it. So basically, if a regulator comes and investigates you, they're going to want to see your data map. And if you can't competently answer and know where your data is going or be able to explain it, that's going to look really bad. So there are a lot of vendors out there who will sell you data mapping software, who will try and tell you that this is the way you have to do your data map. Ultimately, there's no one size fits all. It's just about having internal knowledge. And if you have security people in your company, they can help with this. It's kind of, you need to have a collaboration between the security and the privacy the compliance side and the legal side. Beyond the data mapping is the privacy by design. Now, there's a lot of talk about privacy by design of like what makes a privacy protective product. And there's some principles that are helpful. So data minimization, not collecting more data than you actually need. You'll have a lot of developers and engineers who are like, oh, let's just collect everything we possibly can about this user, and we'll figure out what we can use it for later. Ultimately, that increases your risk. We try and minimize things because it also minimizes risk. Integrity is just about making sure that the data is free of errors, that you are collecting data and that it's good high data quality. Control is about giving users control and allowing them to consent, defaulting to the most privacy protective options. These are high-level principles. Putting them into practice is kind of where the rubber hits the road, but ultimately, the idea is to give players control over their data. I keep saying players, but we're also talking about employees and internal users of data too. So your data subjects. Transfers, we'll talk about this a little bit more in a bit, but just making sure that you have the right legal provisions in place when you are transferring data between parties, because again, it's a risk factor there. Cambridge Analytica. You want to make sure that the people handling your data know what they're doing. Transparency, again, this is just about making sure that people, your data subjects, know what their data is being used for, what data is being collected, trying to minimize surprise. We'll come back to that later. Security, again, very important. You probably have people already in the company who are working on security. It's really important to partner with them and make sure that you have adequate security based on the sensitivity of the data that you're handling. And then retention. This is probably the hardest to put in practice because there's no hard and set rule about retention, but you're supposed to have a retention policy. You're not supposed to hold on to data for longer than you need it. How long do you need data? It's very context sensitive. But it's very important that you've thought through this and not holding on to stuff that's many years old and you forget about it, you have a data breach, oh wow, you've just massively increased the impact of this data breach because there's data that should have been deleted. These are all great principles. I will say the best part of the GDPR, in my opinion, is privacy by design because it gives you an excuse. If you are a lawyer, it gets you a seat at the table. Frequently you want to be talking with your engineers and talking with the product designers and acting as kind of a product counsel. This makes it explicit. This is a requirement that you think about privacy from the very beginning of your planning stages. And it can be really helpful for the lawyers too, because it gets you guys in there, helps you spot problems before the development has already kind of taken place and it's a year or two into the project and it's too late to make any changes. So this is great, and this kind of lets you put on your developer's hat and kind of get closer to the product. Okay, moving on. Data sharing agreements. That is a picture of enriched uranium. Because we joke is now every contract that involves data sharing is equivalent of sharing enriched uranium. It's fine, it's stable, but if anything goes wrong, we're all dead. And you have these really, really low value agreements, and you'll have your engineers who said, look, this is just like a $5,000 contract, we don't need legal review, but they're going to handle our email addresses for us. Yeah, it might be a low value contract, but if that vendor is breached, you have millions of dollars in damages. It's your uranium problem. So it really puts a premium on making sure that these agreements are well thought out at any time that there's personal data involved. So I could spend literally the entire panel just talking about how to negotiate these agreements, but let's just kind of hit the main points. First question is there uranium involved? Is there personal data involved? Are you just talking about aggregated statistics? Are we talking about giving player IDs? Are we talking about sharing email addresses? is the vendor collecting email addresses for you? If they're like a Twitch plugin, are they collecting Twitch behavioral history and then sending it to you associated with the Twitch ID? Again, this is very context sensitive. Oftentimes you can save yourself a lot of hassle if you just change what the deliverable is. If you're not asking for personal data, if you're not asking for anything that's associated with an individual, that can make your lives a lot easier. You still want to have some language in the contract saying you're not going to derive personal information from this or try and identify. You want to make sure that everybody is on the same page about what is and is not going to be collected. But you can save yourself a lot of time that way. Second, assuming that there is personal data involved, who is the controller? Who is the processor? Who's the joint controller? These are terms that are very common in EU speak. They might be a little bit more foreign in the US, but basically the controller is the person who decides what is going to happen to the data. The processor is the person who is acting basically as an agent on behalf of the controller. Sometimes you have joint controllers, where both parties are collecting and using the data in tandem for their own purposes. A lot of times you will have processors who want to be controllers. Vendors who are taking the data and they say, oh, we want to be listed as controllers, and that's how we want to negotiate our agreements. That can be a trap, because that means they want to use the data for their own purposes. And that means that they could use the data and sell it to your competitor. They could use it and monetize it themselves. Ultimately, the name controller processor doesn't make as much of an impact as what is actually in the contract of what can you do with this data. You could say, okay, fine, you're your controller, you guys can be joint controllers, but I'm still putting in the contract that you're not allowed to use this data for your own purposes. Maybe you can use aggregated data for their own purposes. Maybe if they want to improve the product, they can use an anonymized form of the data. But ultimately, allowing them to use the email addresses that they've collected for you for their own marketing, not a great experience for the end user, and opens you up to a ton of risk. Next, once you've established that, it comes down to the nitty-gritty. Now, I won't go through all of this, but it's just about having adequate security in place. Again, this is somebody handling enriched uranium for you. You want to make sure that they know what they're doing. So usually there are certain certifications or security standards that they can warrant that they've complied with. I won't give you a specific standards because they're always changing, like SOC or ISO. But your security team will know what is adequate security for the level of data, the level of sensitivity of the data involved. So you want to make sure that everybody on board is comfortable with the level of risk and the level of security that your vendor is providing. Other things that are important, notification of a breach. Under the GDPR, you have 72 hours to notify the authorities in case of like a big data breach scenario. A lot of these companies won't agree to notify you, and they'll say we'll give you notification in 71 hours, or 24 hours or 48 hours. The longer you wait, if the breach is already known, the more difficulty you're putting on yourself, because then you have less time to react when you do find out about the breach. And you don't want to be late. Notification of sub-processors. So, a lot of contracts will have, we can sub-process our agreement to another vendor, and we don't have to tell you. Well, generally speaking, you want to make sure that at the very least, the legal requirement is that the sub-processors are held to the same data terms as the main processor. If the processor is agreeing not to use the data for their own purposes, they can't get around that by then going to a sub-processor who will then mark it. So that's, but in general, you also want to be notified, have an opportunity to object to a sub-processor if they want to sub-process to Cambridge Analytica. You may not want that. You may want to be able to object and be notified and terminate the contract even if they want to use a sub-processor who has adverse interests to your company. That doesn't happen often, or in my experience, ever, but it's important to have in the contract, because as more and more sub-processors become scrutinized, you don't want to be in a situation where your processor puts you at risk because of who they decided to work with. Audits are also really important. If anything goes wrong, you want to be able to audit, do a security audit. There's always kind of questions of who pays, etc. Last but definitely not least, who holds the bag? This is by far the most important thing when negotiating this agreement. The GDPR is silent on liability. If there is a processor who gets breached, both the processor and the controller who hired them are on the hook. So the GDPR is silent as to, in your contract, who's going to actually pay out. It's very important that if you have the leverage to do so, you get indemnification. You get warranties and other protections, and they agree to pay if they're the cause of the breach. Ultimately, sometimes it'll go both ways. If you are the cause of the breach, if you sent the data and you caused it, obviously you'd be responsible for that. But again, your mileage will very much vary based on the size of your company and the size of your vendor. You're not going to convince Google to indemnify you. You're not going to convince Amazon. But a smaller vendor, they should be putting this into their business model. They need to have insurance or other sorts of ways of, if you're paying them to handle personal data, enriched uranium, they need to at least have the money to cover you if everything blows out. And they might not, and then that's just a risk that you have to take on as the business and do business with them. Sure.
So when you're talking about the larger entities, let's say you have a contract with Google, for example, and you think there might be a breach, you don't have indemnification involved. To your point of each party being liable, do you think there might be a higher chance that Google would want to step up just relating to publicity factors to sort of take control of that situation? I know it's certainly not something to rely on, but it's something to consider.
It's definitely something to consider when you're assessing the risk. The bigger a company is, the more resources they have to prevent a big catastrophic breach. And we would say if you're doing business with Google and they have a catastrophic data breach, your company is the least of their problems. They're going to have, and they are, for a lot of companies, if they are handling everybody's data and they are breached, they're likely to go bankrupt before they pay out. Ultimately, it's very difficult, and we haven't seen it happen. We haven't seen any company actually be forced to pay out and indemnify. We have these big data breaches like the Home Depot data breach, and that was caused by a vendor. And you don't know the vendor's name, but Home Depot got breached. And so ultimately, you want as protective contractual language as you can get, keeping in mind that the smaller the vendor and the bigger you are, the more likely you are to be seen as the target. The class action lawsuits are going to go after the biggest pockets. Nate, you had a question?
Yeah, thoughts on caps and other sort of ways to kind of address and mitigate some of your risks, shift the risk?
Yeah, liability caps are a big part. That will be a subject of negotiation on the contracts that I've worked on. It kind of depends on other non-data related negotiation factors of just your leverage with the company. But yeah, liability caps are a good way. Just keeping in mind that depending on how much data and the sensitivity of the data, I read somewhere that the average cost of a data breach is about $180 per record. So if you're handling 1,000 email addresses, that's not a lot of email addresses, but that's still a pretty high amount of liability when you factor in, the costs of notification, the costs of potentially defending a class action, the cost of doing credit monitoring if there's credit card data involved. So a cap is a compromise, right? You don't necessarily want to have a cap because the damages could easily exceed the cap for most data sharing agreements, again, uranium. But you can definitely, that's an area where you can definitely negotiate. Moving on, we're almost to the GDPR stuff. How are we doing on time?
It's about 10.
Oh, okay. Great. Okay, so these are some of the rights. Mentioned before, the GDPR is all about giving individual data subjects the rights around their data. There's a lot. We're not going to go through each one, but you'll see, essentially players or employees, but we'll focus on players for the most part, is they want to be able to see their data, fix it if there are problems, erase it. There's a lot of kind of discussion about the right to be forgotten. We'll talk about that a little bit. They want to have certain controls over what you can and can't do with their data. And they want to be able to, again, if you're working with third parties, there's the question of notifying them and having them work to effectuate these requests. They want to be able to take their data and give it to a competitor. In the video game space, that's a very weird prospect of like taking your Activision Overwatch data and porting it over to like a different company. It doesn't really work, but it's in the law, so it's something that people are kind of working on. And the last one is automated processing, which is a very interesting provision because there's this. They have the right not to be subject to automated processing if it produces a legal impact or substantially similar effect. No one knows what that is. What is a legal impact? I mean, if I see a different ad than you, is that like the equivalent of a legal impact? Probably not. If I see a different price for my game based on an automated decision-making algorithm that said that I'm a higher spender, it's getting a little bit more gray and it's a little bit more tricky. Although I didn't have a place to put it in, but there's new minimum ages for underage users. So if you're doing, if you have a game that's directed at kids, the minimum ages are changed. It used to be 13, 16. It's now generally 16. Okay, so let's talk about these data subject access stuff in practice. So I said most of the big player rights are about, I want to see my data, I want to fix it, I want to delete it, you have to be transparent with me. And so there is a process for that. It's the data subject access request process. So every company that does business in the EU now has to have something in their privacy policy or otherwise telling users how they can get a copy of their data, how they can request it, how they can see it. That is incredibly interesting and complicated problem of scale. I have a lot of companies do this manually because they have like 4 or 5 customers a year who bother to read the privacy policy and send them an email saying, hey, I want to see my data. And they get an engineer to do it and they just compile everything that they can find and they send it. That might work for now, and that might work for a small enough company, but as you get bigger, this is going to be a bigger problem. And we have seen what we sometimes refer to as the GDPR DDoS. Somebody on Reddit says, hey, let's harass this company, let's all ask for our data at the same time. And you have a lot of bot requests. There are services that you just type in your email and they will mass generate these to every company that you've ever seen. It is a scale problem, and you need to have a plan. The bigger you get, the more you will potentially be a target for this. We, at both EA and Ubisoft, we saw this was a risk. So we talked to the customer service team because ultimately we wanted to direct people through there for authentication purposes. And we realized that we were going to get overwhelmed. All it takes is one bad article in Kotaku, one very vocal user kind of organizing. So we needed to have a plan for dealing with scale. So a lot of companies, Google and Facebook were kind of the first out of the gate. Now both Ubisoft and EA have done it. They've created an automated tool, a self-service tool for you to download your data without any human involvement. This is a couple of notes on this. Again, I'm not speaking on behalf of EA or Ubisoft, but practical advice, this is a lot of data. This is not everything. And most of these services are very clear in their flows that this is the data we think you care most about as a user. We have potentially megabytes or gigabytes or terabytes, not terabytes, but we have a lot of data about you. A lot of it is gobbledygook that you're never going to understand. It only makes sense to our engineers. But we're going to give you the stuff that we think is most relevant to you. And we're going to try and put it in the most accessible format. The Ubisoft one is like in a spreadsheet. It's like an Excel spreadsheet. EA does it as this JSON file. Editorializing, I think it could be clearer. I think, ultimately the goal is to present something and then say, if you want more, escalate it, ask for more, we'll get the engineers on it. I worked on the Ubisoft data download tool. It was really, really interesting to try and kind of figure out what's the doable thing. We had a couple months. We built the UX flow. We talked to the engineers. We kind of figured out what's the best source of the data and what is the data that's going to be most useful. We put it up, and with no fanfare in May, late May, and in the 6 months since it's been live, it has been used over 42,000 times,
Whoa.
which is insane. That way exceeded our expectations. That's great because that's 42,000 complaints that the customer service team doesn't have to deal with. So highly, highly recommend as your company begins to grow and as you start to get these requests to consider an automated tool. It's actually not that hard because a lot of customer service software like Salesforce already has a pretty good customer profile, and it's just about extracting that data or getting to the source of it, creating an API. Sure.
Don't you open up a whole nother can of worms though by grabbing this data and if you don't encrypt it, sending it to them or confirming that the person you're sending to is actually the person?
Absolutely. So that's when we're talking about the UX design, absolutely have to have the security people involved in that to make sure that the flow for getting your data is secure, that you have to authenticate using your credentials before you can get it. We actually had multiple steps of authentication. We sent you an email with a link that you had to go back. Yes, incredibly important, and I'm glad you brought it up because Riot got in trouble. They actually made the front page of Kotaku because they were sending the wrong player's data, which was it. They were doing it by hand, they were overwhelmed, overworked, and they sent the wrong, they messed up. That's a data breach, that's a huge problem. So you really don't want that to happen. That can be a big, big issue. But to your point about encryption, I think that's also a good lead into what are you not going to share? What are you going to redact? In the GDPR, you don't have to share information. The language is very squishy. It says it would adversely affect the right or freedoms of others. What does that mean? Nobody knows. But it doesn't, it's been interpreted generally to mean we're not going to give you trade secrets. If you've been banned, we're not going to tell you the identity of the person who reported you because that would affect their rights. We're not going to share anything internal or confidential. There's a little bit of debate in the privacy community about whether internal communications about a player within employees would fall into that trade secrets, confidential information category. We haven't seen where that's going to land. But it's something definitely to give a heads up to your customer service people of don't be bad-mouthing your, customers in the chats and because there's a potential that might get uncovered. Again, you don't want to be in the situation of having to defend not telling people. Sure.
Sorry, chats are then archived? You guys save chats?
Depends, and that goes back to the data retention issue. A lot of companies will save chats. They might save them a lot longer than you expect because it's just text. Storage is cheap. The last question mark I'll put up down here because I don't think anyone's figured it out is how do you notify the third parties who are dealing with your data? Technically, the user says, I want to delete all the data that you have about me, and I also want all your vendors to delete the data that they have on me that you've given them. That's a really hard question. We haven't seen that really play out. One potential solution is to use a de-identification process. I won't go into details, but basically you have everything tied to a particular player ID, and then you have the player ID connected to like their real name and their personal identification. If you just delete the personal information part of it, and you just have this free-floating identifier, that kind of helps comply with the deletion requests. And it also is helpful because you can still, you will still be able to benefit from the anonymized record. You can still see, oh, somebody who's no longer with us played our game for 60 hours, and we can extract insight from that. Okay, so GDPR, we're all sick of it, let's move on. What's next for 2019? I fooled you, more GDPR. It's not going away, and we're now starting to see enforcement. It's going to be slow. DPAs are still grappling with it. They're trying to figure out where the best test cases are. They don't want to immediately go after Facebook or Google and then lose, and then the whole thing kind of falls apart. So they are looking for easy cases. They are looking at people who handle a lot of data, like the gaming industry. It is still going to be a very risky time. So Aggregate IQ, it's a data analytics firm. They were the first to get notified by the UK Information Commissioner's Office. Here's the real important takeaway here, is this right here. So they've been accused of processing citizens' data for purposes which they would not have expected. They were doing Brexit stuff and Cambridge Analytica. It was very similar to the stuff that you read about Cambridge Analytica, using data for really weird, kind of, unexpected, nefarious purposes. That's really interesting because we have in the video game industry this idea of surprise and delight. Doing things that are unexpected and new is kind of the lifeblood of the video game industry. I always joke about the Psycho Mantis encounter in Metal Gear Solid, where he reads the contents of your memory card and he reads your mind, and it's this great fourth wall breaking moment. And then, some privacy people will be like, you need to have a consent notice that pops up right before it, and he's like, Psycho Mantis is going to read your memory card. Continue, yes or no. So, surprise and delight is really important. And so we can sometimes fall into this question of what can we do? Where are we now? How can we innovate if doing things that are unexpected is now going to get you in trouble with the ICO? And it's kind of like a die answer, but yeah, it's right there. It's delight. It has to be a surprise that people want. It has to be something that people are going to be happy about, that they're not going to raise a fuss about. So I'll give you an example. You have a game that dynamically changes the difficulty of certain random sections, and the game is made harder at certain points because they want you to spend money on power-ups. That's surprising, it's not delightful. People are not going to like the fact that you've rigged the game to make it harder, to make it, kind of squeeze them for more money. If you're making the game easier, if you're making it so that if they get stuck, the game kind of gets easier, and there's certain, random elements that you get like a little bit of a boost. People might still not be thrilled about it, but they're not going to be as angry as if you're trying to squeeze them. So it's really important to keep your players in mind. I mean, everyone here is here because they are passionate about video games and care about this industry. Probably a lot of gamers. You kind of need to know your audience here, and you need to understand what's going to tip them off and make them angry and make them contact the ICO. So, what's next?
Quick question.
Yeah, sure.
So, the way of communicating this usually is through EULA, through terms of service, privacy policy, what we will do with your data. Where do you think is the balance on level of specificity? Like to take the Metal Gear Solid example, you could say we will access data on your memory card for the purposes of in-game cutscenes. Is that sufficient? Is that and maybe for marketing?
Yeah.
Yeah. Have you covered your bases with that?
I will say that privacy policies, that is a good way to cover yourself off. You don't want to do anything that hasn't been put in your privacy policy. you will see there's a lot of like legalese and privacy policy that can be very broadly construed. You'll see very frequently in EULAs and privacy policies to improve your game experience. And that is really easy to construe in a lot of different ways. I don't think ultimately it's an effective stopgap if you do it for something that players don't like. Being like, well, it was in that privacy policy you didn't read is not gonna, people will then start to attack your privacy policy. And you don't want to get into that position.
And to that, I think GDPR has requirements about how you phrase your privacy policy.
Yeah.
It has to be written with non-legalese so that people can understand it.
Yeah, absolutely. There's some really great examples of companies that are trying to innovate in how they present their privacy policy. There's a really cool, there's lots of like proposals out there for interactive privacy policies, video privacy policies. LinkedIn has a good one where it's like collapsible and they have like the legalese on the left and then the real world kind of talk on the right. And like, there's a lot of ways to present it, and it's really helpful and useful. But ultimately, my advice, not legal advice, is don't do anything, even if it's in your privacy policy, don't do anything that's going to piss off your user base, because the privacy policy won't save you from the ICO if they think that what you're doing is unexpected. Okay, so next up, 2019, looking ahead, e-privacy regulation. So the e-privacy directive was passed a number of years ago. It's being made into a regulation that basically just means that it's self-enacting. This is another big gray area, and it's really going to have a big impact on the marketing industry. It kind of depends on how it kind of gets worked out, the recitals and the regulatory guidance. But it's going to affect marketing emails, SMS, phone calls, instant messages, cookies. This is sometimes referred to as the cookie regulation. Internet of Things. I think there's still a lot of uncertainty here. I think the real important thing is that it's going to be based on consent. There are a lot of justifications. So in order to process any data under the GDPR, you need to have a justification, whether it's pursuant to a contract that you signed, whether it's part of your legitimate interest. By far the most common is consent, which is why you're consenting to the privacy policy when you sign up for a service. And the scope of that consent, it's just, you're going to see more consent pop-ups. You probably have seen these cookie banners on websites, at the bottom, when they say these, we use cookies to personalize your content for ads, marketing, things like that. And you'll see that, some of the better banners actually give you some control, even in the banner, of what cookies you want installed. Do you want marketing cookies? Do you want just the necessary cookies? Do you want analytics and attribution? Again, you will likely see more of these banners as time goes on. And a lot of companies, a lot of ad companies even, will provide you this language to use. You put it in their contracts. If you're going to use their advertising or analytics software, you need to have a compliant consent mechanism. Again, that's where we're headed. So if you don't like seeing those banners, sorry, we'll still be around.
Question, do they consider like local storage and session storage to be a cookie, or is there not a difference legally?
What do you mean by local storage?
Where you can store it on a computer using,
Like flash cookies or like?
No, it's I don't really know how it works. I mean, it's not, because cookies are limited to a certain size, right?
True, yeah.
This is unlimited, I think, in size, and and you can put it in your HTML. And
interesting. Yeah, I think. Well, I don't know of anything in the e-privacy regulation that would limit based on size. I think any sort of collection of data, if it identifies, if it constitutes personal information. If the local storage is designed to track the user over time.
Well, it's stored on the client, so
Okay.
it's not stored on the server. So.
Right, but is it used by a server later to identify the person, or is it just?
Yeah, that's the whole point.
Okay, yeah, then it's likely to fall into this, particularly if it's used for marketing. If it's used for like storing the contents of your shopping cart, so between sites,
That kind of thing.
that's probably not going to be fall into the e-privacy thing. This is really about marketing. But again, we don't really know 100%. Okay, on the horizon, we've got a lot more laws coming. A lot of them are in various stages of development. First, you've got a lot of countries that are following the EU's lead. Canada already has a fair amount of privacy legislation. They've got some email legislation, Castle, PIPEDA. They are not subject to the GDPR, but they are really wanting to make sure that they don't lose the European business, so they are likely to be ramping up enforcement to try and make sure that their laws are GDPR equivalent. Brazil passed a law that was basically mirroring the GDPR, and Mexico is following suit. So there are a lot of countries. The reason I spent so much time on the GDPR is because it really is becoming the global standard. It is kind of leading the way, and even if you don't do business in the EU, it's really important to know how this works, because it's really how most of the world is going to work in the next couple of years. Now, the CCPA, the California's Consumer Privacy Act of 2018, is a really interesting case because that was a state law that was designed to mimic the GDPR. And it was passed recently. Weird legislative history, don't have to get into it, but basically it's kind of a mess. It was rushed through in order to prevent a worse version of the bill from going to voters in this last election. So it's not very well drafted. It was designed to mirror the GDPR. It actually goes beyond the GDPR in a lot of weird and kind of unintended ways. I'll give you just one example. I talked earlier about data subject access requests and how you don't have to give trade secrets and you don't have to give information that would adversely harm the rights or freedoms of others. CCPA has the access right. It doesn't have that exception. Seems like an error, because now if it's left without amendment, people could now request the identities, like the personal information of the people who ban them and go and harass them, or request trade secrets. There's a very strong lobbying effort to make sure that there are amendments made to this bill before it becomes effective in 2010. The ESA is very strongly pushing for these bills. There's also a big push in the tech industry generally for federal privacy legislation, because if we have to deal with 50 different competing state laws, it's going to be really difficult and unworkable. Likely could be constitutional challenges, about dormant commerce laws, stuff like that. So there has been federal privacy legislation proposed. Ron Wyden proposed a very, very aggressive bill that would even jail executives who mishandle customer data. We are in a very, very politically volatile climate right now, as you don't need me to tell you, and so there's a lot that's going to happen in the next couple of years when it comes to US privacy law. There's a lot of political pressure coming from the EU for the US to step up its privacy game. All of the scandals with Facebook and Google are just making the need for this more and more pressing. I also mentioned Colorado. Yep.
So, jailing aside, how likely do you think it is that we are going to see what you see in a lot of other regulated fields, where you have individual liability with respect to those officers, those directors, limits on the ability of companies to indemnify officers and directors? In a lot of regulated fields, which data privacy is kind of moving there, that's what you see. How likely do you think we might be to see that in the U.S. or these other territories?
Yeah, when it comes to individual liability, I have no idea. The CCPA and this other federal legislation, it's making it pretty clear that they're going for individual liability, and even in the GDPR, you have to appoint a data protection. One of the requirements of the GDPR we did mention is you have to appoint a data protection officer in your company who's going to be the person legally responsible for data mishandling. And so again, there's a lot of questions about who's really ultimately going to be responsible. I don't have the answer in terms of like individual liability, but I do know that a lot of like the CCPA has a private right of action for data breaches. That's a huge deal because you know the GDPR is enforced by regulatory agents. They act on the behest of their citizens. They respond to complaints, but ultimately they're a government body. When you open this up to the plaintiff's bar in California, it's really going to change the landscape in the U.S. and it's really going to change people's risk tolerances. So that wraps it up. Actually, that's kind of gives you a sense of how far we've come just in the last 12 months, you know, give or take, and where we're going. Games and privacy is continuing to be just an incredibly growing and important field, and it's very exciting. And thank you for your time. We have some time left for discussion. Any other questions?
Sure, I have one. So you talked a lot about how big companies are being affected by GDPR and how they're dealing with data breaches and responses to consumer requests for information. What should indie developers start doing? For those small companies or even those solo game devs who are concerned about their privacy, of either their own or that of people downloading their apps, what are some early ways that they can start doing the right things and making the motions to be in compliance with GDPR and CCPA and every other regulation we have?
Great question. It was actually interesting. There was a bit of a news stir a couple months ago because an indie developer shut down their entire studio and they claimed the reason was GDPR. And they said, we can't afford to comply with this regulation anymore, so we're shutting down. And a lot of the commenters were like, that's not the reason. Like if you, like, it either meant that their game wasn't doing well enough for them to afford to be compliant, or it meant that their business model was actually doing stuff that would be non-compliant. And if you are an indie developer and you think that your way of making money is to buy and sell user data, that you might want to rethink that as your business model, because you're going to need compliance with the GDPR is going to make it very difficult to have buying and selling personal data and your consumers be the product without some pretty serious consent in place. I would think very hard about your privacy policy. I would think very hard about the ways that you want to use data that might be unexpected. I know that's kind of general advice, but you don't want to be making waves right now in terms of the data, collecting data that's weird. If you're collecting biometric information from players, psychographic profiling, things like that, I would say consult the lawyer, consult the privacy expert if you're going to do that kind of tracking and make your game collect an unusual type of data. I would say to be very careful in the vendors that you choose and in the agreements that you sign to make sure that you're working with with reputable vendors who are not giving you a good deal because they plan to sell your data. Last, just privacy by design. Really think when you are creating the game and the product yourself, how are you going to follow those 7 principles that I put up before? How are you going to make sure you're only collecting the data you need, that you delete it when you're done, that you give some certain levels of control if you think that there are varying levels of consent that you need.
Cool, thank you.
Sure.
So you talked a little bit about how companies face a great danger from potentially just one commenter.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned Reddit. And I was wondering, at my way of example, what was EA's reaction internally to the pride and accomplishment of Reddit?
I can't speak to EA's internal discussions on that.
Or
but
whatever you can speak to about that.
You're just talking about the Battlefront thing?
Yeah.
I can't. I wasn't actually at EA at the time, so I had left it before Battlefront 2 came out. I'd say that the PR team at EA is constantly reading Reddit and the comments and trying to gauge player reaction. There are some very, very smart people at EA who take the pulse of the gamer community, and I think that it's really, they're not always as right or as on top of things as we want them to be, but like they're listening. That sounds creepy after a privacy presentation, but yes, they're listening. Okay,
One thing that you didn't really discuss, but I'd be curious your thoughts on Privacy Shield.
sure.
I've heard good things. I've also heard it's on death's door.
Yeah, I've spent a good amount of time on Privacy Shield. Back when I was at the Future of Privacy Forum before I went in-house, we worked on the EU Safe Harbor, which is like the predecessor to it, and trying to defend it. I was like working at the Department of Commerce, and it is, to be glib, it's kind of like a political football right now. There's obviously a lot of talk about whether it's valid. There's been legal challenges to it. For people who aren't familiar, it's a regulatory regime in the U.S. The FTC and the Department of Commerce have been involved in that companies self-certify to. So if you want to do business in the EU and you want to have transfers out of the country of personal data, you need to have certain mechanisms. You can have model clauses, you can have binding corporate rules, or you can be part of this self-regulatory program. It has been under fire. It has been kind of sorry. There have been a number of kind of legal challenges to whether or not it's sufficient in protecting users' data. I think that it hasn't really made a huge impact on people in terms of how they actually change data. It's kind of, again, this is my own personal opinion, but it seems to me like it's a pretty expensive rubber stamp. But I think it's an important one, and I think that it is, one way or another, there's going to need to be some verification and certification process in the gaming industry. I will put in a good word for some of the other certification bodies that are unique to the industry. The ESRB's privacy program, they can do a privacy certification program that's actually really good. And you sign up for it, and they will review your games, they will review your privacy policy and your statement, and they give you a badge to put on your privacy policy that's saying so you're ESRB certified for privacy, and that's pretty good. Particularly if you're doing kids' data, they also offer age verification services, which can be very, very useful. So I'll give a props to them. Formerly Trustee, now called TrustArc, is another certification program. There are definitely a lot of people in the market right now who are trying to standardize and create systems for certifying privacy so that you can kind of sleep better at night. It's a big market. Not all of them are going to survive. Sure.
So you touched upon the concept of age verification.
Mm-hmm.
Whose age verification model out there do you think strikes the best balance of the sort of competing needs
Sure.
there?
I think Pokemon's doing a great job. I think
Pokemon?
Niantic, the Pokemon company, they use Veritad as their age verification. Most big AAA companies that do work and collect data from kids, they will use age screening and age gates to keep out kids, and they will have, when you play a mobile game, you see the age gate. Technically, if they're following the law correctly, you will have a very different back end and sometimes front end experience based on the age that you put into these age gates, because age verification is so hard to do at scale, and can be very expensive. So it's usually cheaper and more practical to just not collect personal data for advertising purposes for kids, rather than go through the process of trying to get their parents on the line.
Cool. All right, I think we're at time, so let me thank Joe again.